Friends, it is a real pleasure to be with you again today. I hope all is well with you and that the winter hasn't been too rough on you. I, for one, am looking forward to spring. Indeed, if everything goes as planned, the title of my next book will be Sweet Spring Will Come. To even say that title does me good today, just to think about it. Our purpose in appearing on this show is to teach you and speak to you of important facets of Bristol history. We have done that in times past and we'll be doing it in the future. But really, it's my feeling and my opinion that in order to make it really worthwhile, we need to lay the foundation work. And to lay the foundation, I need to tell you how Bristol began. Now, Bristol, first of all, is a founded, deliberately planned town. Some towns happen because somebody will set up a country store at a crossroad or something, and somebody else builds nearby and a blacksmith shop comes or something like that. And maybe they get a post office and usually a mill, and that would be the starting of a town. But Bristol was not started in that manner. The actual Bristol we know today is a deliberately planned and founded town. Now, sometimes confusion arises by names of a community or two that used to exist about where Bristol is. You'll hear the name Sapling Grove mentioned, but Bristol did not began because of Sapling Grove. It is not Sapling Grove overgrown. Sapling Grove was the name of a rural Washington County, Virginia post office, established in 1839, in a home that did stand within the territory of what is the original Bristol now. But it was simply a country rural post office established and named Sapling Grove because the tract of land upon which our town is located, the older part of it, is on the Sapling Grove tract, which was surveyed long before Bristol was ever thought of. That post office was served by the stagecoach line, and for that reason the stagecoach road was moved, and it today passes through the alley just back of my home. And the post office endured until 1853. It was discontinued in October 1853. About 30 days later, the Bristol post office was established, but I'm getting ahead of myself now. Now, also, a portion of this tract of land was called King's Meadows, because Reverend James King, who owned the original plantation, had a beautiful meadow which now encompasses the area occupied by the Cumberland Square Park in downtown Bristol, Virginia, but it reached on beyond the depot and up the hill to the point where I live and beyond. These were his upland meadows. Now, if you could have been here, say 1850-51, what would you have seen? Certainly not a city, not even the semblance of a village. Some have said that Bristol is Sapling Grove village overgrown. Well, no, there was no village of Sapling Grove. But you would have seen part of the old Sapling Grove tract, and you would have seen it as a portion of a large plantation. Some called it Sapling Grove, some called it King's Meadows, and some called it Mountain View because of the area where the house was situated. In 1814, this land came into the ownership of a Reverend James King, bought by his father, and his name was put on the original deed. It never did belong to Colonel James King. That's another myth in Bristol history, but it never belonged to him. James King owned it from the very beginning, the Reverend James King. He wasn't a reverend then, in fact, far from it, as you may have read in my newspaper column, but he did become a very highly respected Presbyterian minister. His original farm the original purchase consisted of about 1,600 acres. He added to it gradually until it numbered over 2,000 acres. On it was a well-maintained, progressive, and very flourishing plantation. The part lying in what's downtown Bristol, Virginia now was mostly meadow. But across the line, in our Tennessee portion, Bristol, Tennessee, was largely in grain crops. So had you passed through here on, say, riding the stagecoach in, say, 1850, you would have looked down in the valley from the high point where the stagecoach went across what's now Solar Hill, and you would have seen, first of all, a great herd of short-horn Hereford cattle grazing contentedly where now the Cumberland Square Park is. Along the stage road, you might have gotten a glimpse of milk cows, for the upper portion, what's now Solar Hill, was the milk cow pasture, where he kept a great herd of milk cows. He had to have a lot of ways of producing food, and milk was very important, of course, because he owned 35 slaves, and they all had to be fed, as well as a large family of his. In 1816-17, he built a house at what's now numbered 54 King Street. Only 2 rooms of that old house remain. It's been built to and around until it's become a very large house, but only 2 rooms of the original 1816-17 house remain. From that high point, he could get a great view of the mountains beyond and the plantation that lay between. It was a beautiful, ideal place. The Reverend David Sullins, for whom Sullins College was later named, did ride the stagecoach through here in 1844. He told of passing through this very area, and told of looking down in the valley and seeing those cattle grazing contentedly down there. But all of this would change, and for a reason. I am well convinced that had there not been for one factor, today, where I live, where the downtown portion of Bristol is, and much of the outlying part of Bristol would still be in farmland. Like probably grain fields would be growing right down where Bristol is now, and cattle would probably be grazing on the hills around Bristol and in the big meadow where now is the Cumberland Square Park. But something happened to change that. A railroad was chartered, Virginia and Tennessee Railroad. It was to originate in Lynchburg, Campbell County, Virginia, and then from thence it would come to a point at the state line. Several surveys were made. One survey would have taken them through Paperville, a little portion of Bristol now. The other survey would have gone down the Island Road, which is west of the main part of Bristol now. But finally, and meanwhile, one man who was determined to found a town here had bought a farm near the old Island Road, the Alexander Sousson place, hoping, if it went that way, to be able to found a town upon it. He was dealing strongly for a town site out near the present Country Club. Bristol had the railroad survey. They did make a survey through that area. And had they chosen that survey, that's where Bristol would have been. But when the final survey was made and accepted by the hierarchy of the railroad company, it ended at a point in Kings Meadows on the state line between Virginia and Tennessee. When that happened, the founder of this city, Joseph Ray Anderson, originally of Blountville, Tennessee, a merchant there at the time, he saw the possibility of founding a town. Anywhere there's a railroad terminal point, you will have the possibility of a town. Well, actually, there were 2 railroad terminal points. Another railroad was planning to come from Knoxville, which would also have to end at the state line. And It, of course, chose the route that would connect with the Virginia and Tennessee, and it was just across the line, but still on the Reverend James King plantation. Well, Reverend James King was an old man at the time, and he didn't have seemingly no interest in, little interest at least, in founding a city. But fortunately, the man who wanted to found the city was his son-in-law, and thus he was solicited to sell some land to the son-in-law. At first, he was somewhat reluctant, but it's said that his Anderson's wife, who was a daughter of King, it is said that she is the one that persuaded her father to let her husband have the land. Whatever the reason, we do not, never will know for sure, I'm sure, I doubt if we do, but whatever the reason, he agreed to the sale. And he sold his son-in-law 100 acres, about half in Tennessee and about half in Virginia. From that point, Bristol was destined to be a double town, and remains so today. The cost of the town site was $10,000. Later, they took a little bit of the acreage off and lowered the price a little bit, but it was originally sold for $10,000. That was done in July the 10th, I believe, of 1852. In the early August, some say the first day and some say the second day. I personally think it was the second day of August. Surveyors with their equipment, headed by Henry Anderson, who may have been a brother to Joseph, at least he was a family member related to him, early on that morning went into the still dew-wet meadows and began to lay out the town of Bristol. One of the chain bearers, he will pop up in next month's program, one of the chain bearers was a 120-year-old slave named Silas Goodson. But that's all I'll tell you today. You'll hear a lot about him in the next program. They worked 2 or 3 days in laying off the town. The surveyor made a master map, and that map was sent to the Horse Alley Printing Company in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. At least it was located in the Horse Alley. And they, using a steam-powered press, printed the first maps of Bristol. 100, I think, in number, but only a handful exist today. I want to now show you how your town began from a map that I have here in my hand. Look long at this, my friends, if you love Bristol, if this is your home. Here is the way the town began, mapped out, then drawn, and then reproduced to advertise the new town. Once this was printed, it was sent to Bristol. You may say probably UPS, no way. It had never been headed up at that time. Probably by rail, no. The railway had been surveyed, but no train had come, no track had been built. What did that leave then? Well, we did have stage service all the way from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C. and points west. And Bristol happened to be on the main line of that stage line. If you come to see me sometime, I'll show you the old stage road. In fact, my property backs on it, I guess I'd have to say, because it's the back of the property. But by stage, they were shipped from Philadelphia to Bluntwell, Tennessee. The late Melinda King Anderson, wife of Joseph R. Anderson, founder of Bristol, Virginia, Tennessee, remembered that Joseph sat up just most of the night, sorting those maps out and deciding where to have them placed. Most of them were placed along the new railroad coming into Bristol. That's why, if you will study old Bristol history, you'll see that lots of our early settlers were from Bedford County, Roanoke County, on into Campbell County, Lynchburg. We got a sprinkling from Montgomery County, several from Wythe County. You can almost map out the railway by looking into the past of early pioneers of Bristol. Some came, it's true, from this area roundabout. He did not put many of these in local stores. That is, there was no store in Bristol, of course, but no country store around here. He wanted to draw from the upstate Virginia and bring in people of means so that they could really develop the town. That doesn't mean there were not any wealthy people around here, but there were not as many as there were up toward Lynchburg. Now, let me emphasize that we're here because of the railroad. If you, like I, feel a real gratitude for having a city in which to live, thank the railroad, because we would have never been here had it not been for those railroads coming here. I live within hearing of the railroad yard. At night I hear the trains blow over there, and I feel a tinge of thankfulness that they came. Otherwise I would not have had a city to choose as home back in 1953. Well, the result was good. Now, he wanted, this is no disparagement of my neighbor city that I love so well, even Abingdon, Virginia. I love Abingdon. But it was up and coming town at that time. But the town fathers would not allow these to be put up in the courthouse at Abingdon. They did not want competition. As it was, I guess there were people who jumped the traces in Abingdon because we got many of our early settlers from Abingdon. Some of the most prominent businessmen came out of Abingdon. Several came from Blunteville, Tennessee, where the map was displayed in the courthouse. But I have thought of that often. Even though we were not allowed to put the maps in the Abingdon courthouse, people learned about it, and we did get some of our, in fact, the second mayor of Bristol, Virginia, was an Abingdon merchant who left Abingdon and came to Bristol. Well, this map, of course, was modified a great deal when they started building. For example, they had lots fronting on a street that did not exist, so they had to lay out a street to accommodate those lots, and that became one of our busiest downtown streets now, Shelby. And names were changed. On the original map, there was only one street that had a name, and that was Main Street, which is now State Street. The others all had numbers. At the same time that, approximately the same time that Bristol was laid out, Samuel E. Goodson, who was the first cousin of the Reverend James King, owned land that came as far south as Beaver Creek. Upon that, he laid out a town called Goodsonville and mapped it, and his streets did have names. I think I used a program several months ago, just about the names of the streets of Bristol and how they got their names. Well, Goodson named those on the other side, and his town joined the original Bristol, Virginia at Beaver Creek. His town had some development. 1853, the first house was built on the Bristol. At first, it was planned that this house would be built in Virginia, near the depot site. Meanwhile, Reverend James King had given a depot lot on both sides of the state line, and his wife, being a Virginian by birth, wanted to live in Virginia. And she, of course, did not try to rule her husband, at least not openly, and she wanted to build right in front of the depot, where there was a spring flowing out of the hill where the depot is now, or the little rise, they called it a hill. Well, for some reason, Anderson wouldn't agree to that, and he built over in Tennessee, and she, a submissive wife that she was, never complained. Another thing she wanted him to do was to name this new town Paradise. It had been a paradise to her. As a child, she played all over it. She picked wild strawberries where the depot is now. And to her, it was paradise on earth. And he considered it very seriously. I have seen the old account book that he used to mark out the names that he was thinking about naming this new town. Paradise was number 2 on the list. It got to second place as a choice for the name of the town. How would you like to live in Paradise, Virginia now, or Paradise, Tennessee? Well, it's not so far-fetched. There is a place in Pennsylvania called Paradise, Pennsylvania. I think in Lancaster County. I wouldn't swear to that, but I think that's where it is. It's not such a far-out selection, but Anderson was thinking in practical terms, and he had hoped that this city would become a great iron smelting center. There was already ironworks going on around here, and so he put down in his book 7 or 8 names, made one mark past them. Each mark was a point, and like we do, make 4 marks and then slash across it. That's 5. He did that on those names. He even thought of Kingston, Kingsville for the town, Andersonville, and so on. But at the final as it developed, he could not keep his mind off of Bristol, England, in Wales. That was a great industrial city, and is today. Well, he vetoed his wife's desire and called it Bristol. She never complained about that, though she admitted to her granddaughter one time, I would have still, she said, when she was 88 years old, I would still like to have had it called Paradise because it was truly a paradise to me. Well, he had hoped to found a town that would be the very epitome of business and industry, and also he wanted to be a morally upright town. He said he was going to put in every deed, it's on the bottom of this map, that no one could sell liquor or make liquor or any kind of spirituous drinks, he called them, in any lot in the city. Well, I've read every deed that he wrote, and I spent months in the courthouse going through all of the old records, and I read every deed that he wrote, and that was not in one deed, and why I've never been able to explain. The truth is, what he had hoped to become a sort of a paradise, and what his wife had hoped to become a paradise, was just the opposite for many years. It became a wild, woolly railroad town on the border. Anderson built the first house in the town, which served as a home and his store building. He had a big room in it for his store. That was over on the corner of what then was 4th and Main. It's the southwest corner now of State and Martin Luther King Boulevard. 2 or 3 years ago, I was able, after long years of trying, to get a state marker put on the site of where the old original point that Bristol began. It's there today. The country music folks put another marker just below it, marking the site of where the country music records were made. Indeed, they were made in his old store building, that not the one he first built, but in 1881 he erected a 3-story building on that lot, 410 State Street, and that's the building in which the recordings were made, on the 2nd floor, front room next to the street. They hang quilts over the windows, deaden the sound. Hottest fire up there in August, but nevertheless, that's where it happened. The stories have arisen that it was a hat factory or a warehouse. They're not true. It never was a hat factory. It never was a warehouse. The way that got started, the Cox Wholesale Hat Company and the Taylor Christian Hat Company also had the building there at times. The name appeared on the side of the building, but a distribution, wholesale distribution point for hats, but not a factory, nor a warehouse. Now, Anderson's home, of course, was the first house in Bristol, Tennessee. It's only fair to tell where the first house was in Bristol, Virginia. Across the street, near where the True Point Bank is now, is where the first house in the Virginia side of town was built. In 1856, a move arose to incorporate it. Well, it's hard to incorporate one town in 2 states. Tennessee incorporated in Tennessee, Bristol, Tennessee. Across the street, across the main street in Virginia, there's a man that had become an enemy of Anderson, over the drinking question, over the liquor question, and he led a move to have the Virginia side incorporated as Goodson, based on Goodsonville, I suppose. It was just north of it. But Goodson did not, the original town of Goodson included both the Bristol, Virginia, and the town of Goodsonville. That's a point that gets a point of confusion. That's where most historians jump the track. But as it was a composite town made up of the original Bristol, Virginia, and the original Goodsonville. It did come under the name Goodston and endured until 1890, when they reincorporated and changed the name back to Bristol. It's always a point of confusion. The railroad company, you can't dictate to a railroad company. They know the king of the walk, and an effort was made to try to get them to change the name of the depot. I've seen the letter they wrote back. We set up the depot at Bristol, Virginia. All of our papers are set up that way, and all of our regulations, all of our everything in the works is set up for Bristol, Virginia, and in no uncertain terms, they closed the letter, said, we have no intention of changing the name of the depot. And so it remained Bristol, Virginia, even when it was in a place called Goodson. And this was a tremendous source of confusion. I do not have the time to tell you of some interesting things that happened because of that. And the post office, through most of those years, remained as Bristol. And so it was everlasting confusion, especially to the railroad. And so one of the railroad men who got himself elected to the city council made the motion to change it back to Bristol. That man sleeps today in the East Hill Cemetery, our historic old East Hill Cemetery, Charles Finch. And thus it became totally Bristol again in 1890. Today it's still a double town, both under the name Bristol, but there's two governments, two school systems, two fire department, and on the list goes. But we are doing our best to work in harmony, and we have a beautiful, prospering city here on the state line. I am not a native, but I chose it as my home, and part of the reason, perhaps yes, I can honestly say the main reason that I chose it as home was partly because of the area being so beautiful, partly because it had no other home, partly because it offered me job opportunity, finally to become the city historian, and most of all, I chose it as home because of the kindness, the goodness, and the helpfulness of the people that are here. You may find their equal somewhere in the wide world, but you won't find any better. And so Bristol, this town on the border, has become my home. And I felt it my duty to learn all I could about the history of the town. And today I live history, that's my work. I have a very interesting time imparting the history to people round about. Made many friends that way. When the phone rings here for information or other reasons, I never know whether it's the next door neighbor, whether it's California, or whether it's Australia. There's one good side of benefit of that. I seldom ever let a person go without finding out how the weather is in their country. I get reports from all over America like that live at the very moment. That's just a little side benefit that comes from being able to serve as the city historian of both Bristol, Tennessee, Virginia. This map is on record in both courthouses here, I think, and in the Bluntville Courthouse and the Abingdon Courthouse. If you wish to really study it and see it, I have a copy here made. This is the original. I don't handle it much, but I have copies made of it if you want to see just how the city was. Oh, so many other things I could tell you. My first book of Bristol history goes into extreme detail of just about how the town started and so on. But I've given you a sketch, and I hope this is sufficient for the time. Until we meet again, may I say, the best in life be yours.